you've obliterated ego consciousness. There is no semblance of the structured brain activity necessary to maintain ego consciousness. So there's no ego. Psychedelics are relaxing our beliefs. They're relaxing our assumptions. Predictive coding says we experience the world, we experience everything through internal predictive models. And they work to data compress, to downsample, to catch the gist of things. That's how the mind and brain work ordinarily. What psychedelics do is to really sort of unzip that process.
I thought that decreased brain activity with psychedelics was a pretty consistent, replicated finding. No,
this is it's a popular myth.
Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris is the world's leading psychedelic researcher. He has spent 20 years alongside David Nutt scanning the brains of people on psilocybin, LSD and DMT. He has collaborated with the giant himself, Carl Friston, and together they propose that psychedelics work by dissolving the brain's confidence in its own deeply held beliefs, loosening the grips of the predictive models that hold your sense of self in place. Carhart-Harris goes further with this entropic brain hypothesis, proposing that consciousness can be measured by the disorder of brain activity. The more chaotic the signal, the richer the experience. A puzzling paradox we unpack bit by bit throughout this episode. Subscribe if you want to understand why 2 doses of mushrooms just matched the best antidepressant that Big Pharma has ever made.
It's been a conventional thing to see the brain almost like a temperature system, like getting hot and cold. We overlay these maps of hot and cold colors, like, oh, this is really hot, look at all that white hot red blobbage on the brain, or oh, there's some blue blobs, that's the brain shutting off. And it's misleading. Don't look at the brain as getting hot or cold. A better way to think of brain function, think of the brain along a dimension of order to disorder. Entropy is formally a measure of the unpredictability of a thing. When there's more order, there's actually less consciousness. When there's more disorder, to a point, you could say there's more consciousness. There's an expansion of consciousness, and that's the psychedelic state. I would say it's the basic metric for consciousness is brain entropy. The best biomarker is brain entropy. It's the simplest map for the territory.
Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, you are a true giant in the field of psychedelics. It's such an honor and a pleasure to have you on the podcast. For the listener who maybe isn't familiar with you or familiar with your work, what's the most important context for them to understand your scientific journey?
Oh, context. Well, it's kind of varied. First of all, thanks for that lovely introduction. Appreciate it, Evan, and great to be with you. Yeah, it's kind of varied because I sometimes think and say that I've come at the topic from the 2 poles of psychology, you might say. I would say one pole would be cognitive neuroscience, classically rigorous and disciplined, looking for objective measures, crisp definitions. And then the other pole would be depth psychology, psychoanalysis. And for me, those are the 2 extremes of what I'd call psychology. I think neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience is part of psychology. Yeah, so I guess that's the flavor that I bring is like, I thought he was a neuroscience. Oh, he's a psychoanalyst. Yeah, I can kind of throw people sometimes. And so, yeah, I would say that's what I bring is a quite a wide lens to look at this topic, always from science and academia, always from naturalism. We might want to unpack that. And in a sense, always from psychology. Yeah.
So how did you get started with psychedelics?
Well, I took some LSD. and
As is
turned on.
the story usually starts like that. That's a bit of a trend that I've seen throughout the podcast, as it usually starts. Please tell me about this.
Well, I was a teenager and curious about drugs. I was into dance music, and there's a close association there. I guess most obviously MDMA, but I was really especially curious about LSD, and through some friends, a friend really, we managed to get some. We had a plan. We'd go down to the beach and spend the day and evening sort of wandering around on LSD, and that's what happened. And I wouldn't say it was a pleasant experience. It was mostly unpleasant, very jarring, uh, incredibly jarring. And remember, I'm just 14, so it's quite a lot for uh, um, a teenager to take on. But it clearly impacted me, and that seed event was critical for where I've ended up today. Yeah, it's kind of ironic that taking drugs turned me into a disciplined uh, scholar. Doesn't always work that way, but very drug dependent, perhaps.
I don't think those two things are maybe as orthogonal as a lot of people think as well, oftentimes. But it's interesting as well that what spurred you on your path was a negative psychedelic experience, or it might have been negative in the moment. I'm curious if it then had sort of what was your ruminations on that experience after the fact? Because a lot of the time a trend would be that I've had, spoke to a bunch of people that have done sort of similar early exploration in psychedelics, and it's usually this universal consciousness, overwhelming, oh my God, this is incredible sort of moment that they remember and that carries through. So it's almost more interesting that you had a mostly negative experience, but still it had that impact on you to want to research. And I'm curious on how that you think that impacted it.
Yeah, I think it did have an impact. That it was mostly negative. It was mostly negative, but yeah, I came through it and was left thinking, "What the hell was that?" Like, that was the most bizarre thing. I never had any kind of preconception that it would be like that. I mean, in the midst of it, I thought I was probably dead, to be experiencing something like that. So my, adult reasoning went along the lines of maybe I was hit by a car on the road, and now I'm in a limbo space or in hell. Um, I'm trying to fathom how it is that my consciousness is so profoundly altered. I guess I thought that I was just going to see some, little green men running around or something, and that it would be a visual display, but instead it's your whole being is altered. Um, and I wasn't ready for that. So yeah, it was mostly negative, but it left me certainly with a sense of awe, incredibly profound awe, and a desire to better understand what that was. And yeah, I'm very young at that age, so, and not especially academic at all. Really, the opposite, more a sort of rebel without a cause in a sense, or an obvious cause. And but I did gravitate down a track of being drawn to science. Um, A levels in biology, chemistry, um, and um, and psychology would, and that's where I caught my intense love of that topic, and my first introduction to depth psychology, to Freud. And that wasn't sold to me. In fact, it was the opposite. It was like, don't take Freud seriously. But I looked at it and I was like, this is amazing. And so that happened very, very young, around that age. And then yeah, again, my degree, it was biochemistry initially. I didn't complete that, but then went on to do my psychology degree, and then a psychoanalysis master's degree, and then a PhD in psychopharmacology. So you can see this sort of jumping from the harder science of psychology to the richer, deeper psychoanalysis. And that's been my track into what I do today.
Super, super interesting. If we fast forward a bit to, you're an established neuroscientist, an established neuropharmacologist, and you're scanning the first brain on these different psychedelic substances. So LSD, psilocybin. What is that moment like? I'm trying to, compare 14-year-old you on the beach in England somewhere freaking out and taking this thing for the first time to then being the first person to see, or you and your team, and I know David Nutt was involved, who I'm a huge fan of, your team, seeing that first brain and seeing the substance work in that brain. Like, what was that moment like?
Before we get into what Robin found out when he put that first psychedelic brain in a scanner, I want to tell you a really quick story that happened to me. So I was working with a company to build a really cool science product, and we were using AI to synthesize the research and the literature. And a hallucination crept its way into the work. The citation looked good, it was given to me confidently, it was linked perfectly, formatted great, it looked like a legit source, but it was a complete fabrication. I think we all relate to this. This is just a property of ChatGPT and Claude. But ever since that day, it has made me terrified of hallucinations, and it's changed the way I think about science and AI, and I think it should change the way you think of it as well. That is why I use Consensus.ai, a long-term sponsor of the channel. Consensus is the largest index of peer-reviewed scientific papers in the world, with over 220 million studies. Consensus searches the actual literature first, then uses AI to synthesize what it found. Every claim always links to a verifiable paper, and that gives me a sense of peace when I'm doing my work. It's the difference between asking an AI to remember science and asking an AI to actually search in science, which is what Consensus does. To prepare for this interview, I searched, does psilocybin have an effect for depression? And pretty much instantly, I got exactly what I needed. It synthesized all of the most important papers, it summarized them in the most interesting way, gave me some interesting questions, and it gave me a consensus meter which shows the consensus over the entire field, or the most important papers in that field. Here's where it gets even better, because Consensus now has an MCP integration with Claude. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. It just means the two systems can talk to each other, and this means that you can prompt Consensus through Claude and create your own highly personalized workflows for doing your research. So I'll give you an example. The way that I've been using this is to put my podcast transcripts into Claude, which will then contact Consensus to pull a full list of citations and papers and graphs and schematics and everything that are related to the transcript and the conversation that I had. So this is a use case that's personal for me, but whatever your research needs, the Claude MCP integration with Consensus basically solves everything. It can do whatever you need it to do. If you use the integration without a Consensus account, you're going to be limited to just 3 search results. So make sure you use the link in the description, go over, get 1 full month of Consensus completely free, hook it up to your Claude, and then have fun with it. Play around with it and have a sense of peace that any source is verified and is not going to be a hallucination. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that. Consensus have been a long-term supporter of the channel. They make the Giant Shoulder possible. So the best way to support us is to go over, sign up, make an account, try it out. I guarantee you'll like it. Tell me your experience below. Thank you so much, and back to the episode.
Well, it was a thrill, and it was very nerve-wracking. I mean, David was really my mentor and shepherded me through all of this. I guess I was getting the work done, but he was the guy making it possible. And I remember when we did our first dosing, it was in a mock MRI scanner in Bristol, in this old hospital, the Bristol Royal Infirmary. And we're walking through this dusty old underground corridor, and patients going past on gurneys. I think I had the syringe of psilocybin solution in my hand or in a box, and David and a colleague are walking along just behind me. I'm like pacing in front, very self-conscious. And I was worried genuinely that David might call it all off. He seemed worried, uncharacteristically. He was going to be the dosing doctor, and then a colleague was to be the dosed. And well, yeah, we were all really nervous. It turned out that trip was relatively mild, but it was a very significant first step on the way. And then we took that pilot work, to the nearest scan center at the time, which was Cardiff, and did most of our early brain imaging work at this imaging center in Cardiff called Kubrick. And it was incredible. I guess coming in naive, you think all you need to do is, in a sense, put the drug in, turn the scanner on, and find the secrets. Very naive like that. And still to this day, we're trying to work out what happened there. What are those initial results? Drops in blood flow. How does that compute with an excited brain?
Right.
More metabolically active, more electrophysiologically, it's activated. So it's long been a paradox, that one. But yeah, it was a thrill with everything that a thrill brings. Elevated heart rate, and what are we doing? I hope this is okay. Trust the process. Watching the participants' heart rate go up in the scanner while ours are going up in concert. And it's such a privilege to be able to do that
Right.
work. I don't think people always appreciate perhaps just how difficult it was, though. It really was, and continues to be honest, pretty uphill. You don't win mainstream funding for this kind of work. Almost, nothing there in terms of support from mainstream bodies. It's just been, very disappointing for a long time. But lifted up by philanthropy and lifted up by scientists with a very pure passion and curiosity. And it's really that, you push against something for long enough, hard enough, and it gives. And that's the way it's gone for us.
The story. I love it. I can imagine you kind of being, shepherded by David Nutt through the hall, and you're holding a syringe and you're just so nervous about what the hell this could even do in the brain. And I really want to touch on a lot of the state of psychedelic research later, because I'm very curious to get your opinion on that. But did you have a hypothesis going in? Did you have any idea what this was going to do in the brain? Like, what was known about it at the time? They would have maybe done some like receptor ligand assays, so you would have some idea of some binding, but like it's never been, scanned in a brain. So we really didn't know what was going to happen, right?
That's right. Yeah. We knew at this stage that psychedelics are serotonergic drugs. They bind to an aspect of the serotonin system. That we knew it was the serotonin 2A receptor, and we knew where they were in the brain, where they are in the brain, in the cortex, heavily distributed throughout. We knew from some pioneering work done by Franz Vollenweider that psilocybin increases metabolic activity in the brain, in the cortex. And so that's what we were expecting. Our first imaging modality looks at blood flow, arterial spin labeling. It tracks blood coming into the brain. And so I expected to see it go up. Amanda Fielding certainly did. She's the founder and director of the Beckley Foundation, and like David, helped make this work possible, and had a strong passion about this hypothesis of increased blood flow in the brain. And so it was a hard pill for her to swallow to see this decrease in brain blood flow. And that's been replicated with psilocybin since. It hasn't been replicated with LSD, curiously. We saw increases in blood flow there in the visual cortex when we used that. that method. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, but yeah, I would say um, it probably. I'd probably say these days it was likely a red herring. It was a misleading result. We did the obvious thing and interpreted it as dropped brain activity. I just don't think that holds anymore, that interpretation. I actually suspect it was probably a temporary vasoconstriction. So the vessels um, are known to constrict with psychedelics. That was found back in the 60s, I think, in some uh, umbilical cord of sheep. Um, so it seems, I think it's that. We know from electrophysiological recordings that the brain across species that neurons are excited by psychedelics. They become more excitable, and that translates into something that we record in relation to the predictability or otherwise of brain activity. It becomes more chaotic, more random, more entropic. I call that the entropic brain. So in 2012, we published on these drops in blood flow and this desynchrony within the cortex and especially in this default mode network, a desynchrony there. That was a seminal paper in 2012, the neural correlates of the psychedelic state. And I think the error there was to say drops in blood flow, drops in brain activity. But the bit of gold that we found was the network desynchrony that's really held up and was supported by a Nature paper. I was lucky to be co-author on, Josh Siegel leading that. Um, I think published in 2024, psilocybin desynchronizing the brain. And so that held. So, this is often the way it goes in science. You get one thing wrong and one thing right. You you scaffold on the stuff that you're getting right, really, while learning and discarding what you get wrong. It's very Darwinian in a sense. Um, but yeah, it's and very much a sort of iterative scaffolding process.
I thought that decreased brain activity with psychedelics was a pretty consistent
No,
replicated finding. No.
no, this is
Interesting.
yeah, it's a popular myth. I love David Nutt. Well, he's been stuck on that one for a while, and yeah, it's not solid. There isn't
Tease
a
that
drop.
apart because that's super interesting to me. Like break apart that nuance.
Yeah, so we come in to look at the brain through brain imaging, and it's been a conventional thing to see the brain almost like like a temperature system, like getting hot and cold. We overlay these maps of hot and cold colors, like, oh, this is really hot. Look at all that white hot red blobbage on the brain, or oh, there's some blue blobs. That's the brain shutting off. And it's misleading. Those are maps run through statistical models. Um, a better way to think of brain function, and this is something I realized quite early on. The Entropic Brain paper was a seminal paper on this point, published in 2014. Um, and I was saying, don't look at the brain as getting hot or cold, but in a sense, look at more at what temperature does to molecular organization. As an analogy, it jiggles molecules up, it excites them, and they move around more randomly. They'll go through state transitions from solid to liquid. That's the way to think of the brain. Think of the brain along a dimension of order to disorder. Broadly speaking, order cold like an ice cube, uh, disorder hot like a gas, heated gas. And so that's the entropy thing. Entropy is formally a measure of the unpredictability of a thing, how hard it is to predict across time. The more unpredictable, the more entropic. And so collating at the bits of data that we got from using 3 different brain imaging modalities at that point, 2 from fMRI, arterial spin labeling, and then the classic bold signal that it allows us to look at brain network integrity and communication, something called functional connectivity. So we had those 2 things from that PNAS paper in 2012, the neural correlates of the psychedelic state. We had a more recent MEG study looking at oscillatory activity using the best modality to do that, which is still MEG, magnetoencephalography. And we put them together. I put them together and said, look, I think it's, in a sense, I think it's a desynchrony. That's how Josh would word it, Josh Siegel today. But it reads out formally as an increase in entropy. And I showed, look, the areas of the brain are consistent, and it's just really how we should interpret the change. And I suggested to the world that we interpret it along this dimension of brain activity becoming essentially more disordered. And that was the entropic brain.
Super interesting. I don't think it's commonly known that psychedelics don't necessarily decrease brain activity,
Yeah.
even amongst very reputable neuroscientists. Because I've had
Yeah.
that discussion many times. Because I've always thought about this paradox of having decreased brain activity, but this increased subjective experience and this increased consciousness. It's been one of those questions that's been very puzzling for me over maybe the last 50 episodes. And
Yeah.
I've mentioned this to many, again, big neuroscientists, and they were like, "Yeah, this also puzzles me." So maybe
Yeah.
you need to start
Well,
screaming from the rooftops a bit more. You need to get out the
maybe.
megaphone and and spread this
Yeah.
word.
I do here and there. But so it's, there's a kernel of truth to it, but it's just been pushed too far. The brain certainly doesn't shut off. Nothing shuts off. The default mode network doesn't shut off. It actually gets excited. But what that translates into is more random activity, and the constraints that a big system like the default mode network can impose on other brain regions and functional units is lessened. So in that sense, there is a functional dysregulation of the default mode network, and you could say it goes away because of that. So it gets jiggled up, scrambled up, and then loses its form. And it's more that than it going away. It certainly doesn't go away through being shut off or actively inhibited. It gets scrambled. And again, that analogy is like, heating an ice cube and then melting that constraint and that order and that structure and that form. And so when you do that, when you dysregulate regulating systems and also regulating rhythms, that's really important, like the alpha rhythm in the brain, a dominant rhythm in the waking human brain. When you dysregulate this structure, whether it's default mode network or a dominant rhythm like alpha, then you're causing a loss of constraint. You're allowing an opening up, a liberation, a freedom. Computationally, those who are computationally minded and familiar with the jargon and way of thinking could think of it as a data upsampling in a sense. You go from the usual downsampling, data reduction function of the brain, which is how the brain works. It catches the gist of things, like how we're catching the gist of our conversation, not caring about the details of the sounds that are coming through my vocal cords and into your ears and how that all happens. We're just catching the gist of it, going with that flow. So there's a massive data reduction, downsampling going on. But under psychedelics, there's a reversal of that. downsampling, so that we're more kind of upsampling things. We're tuning into more granularity. And funnily enough, you see that in the brain. You see more granularity. You see faster rhythms. You see finer grained patterns emerging, and yeah, being more present in an fMRI time series, an fMRI recording. You get these bittier, finer grained patterns appearing, and the big coarse grained patterns like the default mode pattern, they go away. So in a roundabout way, you could say that the default mode network's going away, but it's kind of how it happens. Yeah. It's not getting shut off by a direct inhibition. That's what we thought initially, but I think we were wrong. It's, you could say, going away, inverted commas, by being excited and dysregulated.
Yes. I mean, the real thing is never as simple as activity goes down, right? When you're speaking of a complex system like the brain, it's even hard to know what that sentence even means. Activity goes down, because as you say, you have both regulation and dysregulation, and there's just so many different processes going on that activity goes down is so simplistic that it kind of doesn't really mean much at all.
It's so simplistic that it's misleading, and I think that's the thing. And so I strongly encourage people not to think of the brain as some kind of thermostat that goes up or down. Think of it more as a complex system that is, its most basic dimension might be one ranging from order to disorder. In this immense complexity, when there's more order, there's actually less consciousness. When there's more disorder, to a point, you could say there's more consciousness. There's an expansion of consciousness, and that's the psychedelic state. Ordinarily, you don't see it. This was a finding of ours. The first sort of key finding was 2017, collating MEG data from psilocybin, LSD, and ketamine, all acquired in Cardiff, actually, with a collaborator of mine, Suresh Muthukumu Raswamy. It's a long name of Sri Lankan origin. And there we in collaboration with Anil Seth, well-known consciousness researcher. I wonder if you've
Big
had
fan.
him on. Yeah,
Big
he's
fan,
great.
yeah. Big
He's
fan.
a friend and long-term collaborator. And there we saw this, probably for the first time in a very compelling way, we saw this increase in the entropy or complexity of the spontaneous brain activity seen through that MEG modality. And seen with two classic psychedelics, psilocybin and LSD, and one psychedelic-like dissociative anesthetic, ketamine. Incidentally, it turns out that ketamine has an entropic brain effect when it's psychedelic-like, and when the dose gets so high that it becomes an anesthetic, entropy comes down. So it's one of those extra sort of validation checks for the hypothesis or principle for the entropic brain. Another one that people might like is that, anesthetics, they'll drop consciousness, they drop brain entropy. Disorders of consciousness, entropy down, of course, by definition, consciousness down. But in those lucky few, if you track them, if you have an EEG on their heads and they wake up from, just broadly speaking, let's say a coma, they emerge and wake up, then you see entropy come up as they wake up. I would say it's the basic metric for consciousness is brain entropy. The best biomarker is brain entropy. It's the simplest map for the territory. Doesn't explain it all, but it describes it very elegantly in very few terms. And that's what you want with a good model. You want that elegance, to explain a lot with little.
Yes. This is something that I really wanted to get into the nitty gritty with you, because this entropic brain idea is fascinating to me. I'm really curious how you map entropy to a conscious state, like an actual experience. Because even, again, if we summarize a little bit of what you said there, if the way to think about brain entropy is the orderliness of the information, how structured it is, how patterned it is. So what you're saying is that a highly unstructured, unpatterned, uncompressible brain state has more conscious experience, right?
Yeah.
There's more consciousness, there's more experience, there's more going on. And then a very orderly brain, which we might see during, I think, REM sleep. It's very patterned, it's
No,
very
not REM
cyclical.
sleep.
Or REM
Sorry.
sleep, sorry, deep sleep.
In deep sleep. In deep sleep.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, deep sleep. Yes, good, important correction. You see that obviously correlated with either no consciousness or some minimal amounts of conscious experience. Why would that be the case, or what's your idea there? Because it's that still seems a little bit paradoxical to me, where you have disorder and you have not patterned and you have not compressible, and that means more conscious experience. Where maybe intuitively you might think it could be the other way around.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to a nuance, which is if the brain, we'll get to it straight away. In fact, if the brain is so disordered that there's zero structure, then how can that have any kind of content to consciousness? I think we can come back to that because it is a critical point. And it would be, is there an extreme to this model, extreme entropy, where the model and its mapping to consciousness begins to break? I call it like the farthest frontier for this idea is stretching the model to breaking point. And that's what you want to do with a model. It's like you want to break it to see where its limits are. But within the zone that it works very well, which is actually a broad zone, it is the case that if you have more organized activity, if all of the neurons, let's just say it very simply, are going up and down their electrical fields that are the product of an averaging of electrical activity over a vast number of cells, is like the din of a crowd, vast crowd going up and down in sync. If they're all going up and down in sync, there's effectively no consciousness. And that would look like seizure, everything in the brain going up and down in sync. And what happens in the middle of a seizure is there's unconsciousness, there's no consciousness. And it is what happens in deep sleep. It's just a different kind of rhythmicity, somewhat dependent on the thalamus in the middle of the brain, keeping everything in sync. The neurons kind of almost literally go to sleep. They go into these down states. And so everything's doing the same thing. It's just lacking any real any surprise. Everything's just very, very predictable. Same in the anesthetized state. Yeah, basically every state that you could think of where there's unconsciousness, entropy's down. It's super solid. It's used to titrate anesthetic dosage. This metric. So very reliable at that end of the consciousness spectrum, the low end or the no end, entropy down. And so our discovery in 2017 was that normal waking consciousness, which for a good while was thought to be the sort of apex of signal complexity in the brain, meaning it's highest there, and consciousness is at some kind of apex in normal waking consciousness. Evolutionarily, you might think that, well, this is the top of the mountain. But what we found with psychedelics was, oh no, it's not. You can go higher, and entropy goes up above its ordinarily high level in normal waking consciousness. And qualitatively, you don't have someone becoming unconscious. To the contrary, they say things like, my consciousness expanded. And for a while, we thought that that was new age pseudoscience and, hippie talk. But actually, there's a basis to it. It feels like that. And what something feels like has a basic ontology, as the philosophers would say, has a basic reality. It's real. What something feels like. is bottom line. It's a definition of consciousness, probably its main aspect, phenomenal consciousness, what it feels like, qualia, subjective experience. It's the bedrock of consciousness. And the feeling is one of expansion. There's more to my mind. I mean, people get confused about that and start conflating whether I'm experiencing my mind or am I experiencing more of the cosmos, or and they start to, that distinction between sort of inner world and outer breaks down, distinctions of time, and space break down. So yeah, quite reliably, even in the most extreme psychedelic states, people will talk about this expansion, that consciousness feels bigger somehow. And there's an interesting convergence here, I would say. It looked like it might be another sort of chink in the armor, a flaw in the system, glitch in the matrix for the hypothesis, which was in certain absorbing, immersive meditation states. In experienced meditators, you'll see brain entropy go up. And yet, the typical report for that state of consciousness will be one of stillness. And so, colleagues came to me and said, "Isn't this a challenge?" And I said, "Yeah, it is a challenge. It's an interesting case example. But I think there is a consistency in the size of consciousness. I think in these meditative states, they're sometimes called jhanas, these intense, immersive meditations, consciousness does feel like it expands as it does in the psychedelic state. One of the differences is that there's less fireworks, In a psychedelic state, say with NN-DMT, which is found in ayahuasca, Amazonian brew, or psilocybin or LSD, there's a lot of fireworks. There's a lot of visual phenomena, and you don't typically get that with meditation, but you can. It can be pretty trippy, but brain entropy is a consistent readout there. So I don't think it is new age psychobabble or pseudoscience. This consciousness expansion thing, I think it can be explained, and it can be explained by the entropic brain effect.
Really interesting. So we have some nice data correlating entropy and conscious experience, but I'm curious, is it just in a consciousness on a magnitude scale, or more consciousness to less consciousness? But are there any entropic signals for my experience of the color red, or my taste of the chocolate cake, or, the experience of winning a tennis match, or, you know what I mean? So like the contents of the conscious experience. Would you guess that there is some entropic signal in that? Or is it just a matter of more or less?
It's a good question. So the model doesn't give us that. It is more general purpose than that. So those are specific qualia, specific flavors of experience that are going to depend on a specific encoding. And what we're finding, neural encoding, and what we're finding in cognitive neuroscience is that your encoding of, say, red is not the same as my encoding of red. So there's quite strong and high individual differences in how we specifically encode specific qualia. And that presents a challenge for finding a universal code by which we all encode, say, red. That's a very, very tricky challenge that that we're trying to chip away into. Neuroscientists that do decoding work. So trying to go from brain activity to predict experience, trying to do such things. And they have found that it is possible to predict above chance, what someone is imagining, what someone is dreaming, what someone is watching in terms of a movie, what someone's listening to. That's this decoding work that's been done in cognitive neuroscience. It's very AI relevant, machine learning relevant. You train up a predictive algorithm, a model, um, based on mappings between brain activity and either a behavior or some experience. But even if it's experience, it's read out as behavior, like a button press to say that I'm experiencing something. So that's the method, is this training with a lot of data, deep data, a model to say when this in brain, this in experience or behavior. So learn this association, do it a million times, so to speak. And then from seeing this pattern in the brain, you could predict the experience. That's the decoding approach. And so, like I said, people can do that and predict, say, something like I'm experiencing red in a given brain, but they struggle to make a translation across brains. Like your code for red, while you can predict it in your brain, you couldn't use that code and predict from my brain activity that I'm experiencing red. It's just not the same code. The specifics are different. Like fingerprints, we all have them, but our fingerprints are unique. It's a similar kind of thing. There are like fingerprints in our brains. Our brains are like fingerprints for how we encode. And what we're probably doing when we talk to each other and communicate is making a translation um, between our fingerprints, in a sense. Like, while my code might be different, the experience is the same, and we can share and talk about that. So it's not entirely lost in translation. It's not like you really experience red and I don't. I think the experience is consistent. It's just the specifics of the encoding is different. Yeah, brain
Yeah.
entropy doesn't really give you that. If anything, qualia becomes very slippery, and you can have an intermixing of paradoxes or opposites. So, I'm experiencing blue and red at the same time, or the whole visual light spectrum I'm experiencing in this expanded state on 5-methoxy DMT, or it's a pure clear light of that people describe, with the dying experience. Um, yeah, there's very extreme experiences that people can describe with psychedelics, and so the entropic brain model gives you a kind of general purpose um, model or map of the quality of conscious states along the dimension of the size of phenomenal consciousness, the size of subjective experience. When it's less, brain entropy is less. When it's more, brain entropy is more.
Do you think that's a current limitation of the model and a current limitation of the technology? Or in 10 years' time, when we have the perfect high resolution brain scanning device, do you think there might be some entropic signal in there that we just can't detect today? Or is it just that that's kind of where the model levels out and it has its value, but it probably won't get us all the way to he's playing, a video game, or he's enjoying
Yeah,
cake or listening to
I
music?
don't think my model does that. It's intentionally a general purpose model for conscious states. So I need to know the limits of my own model. It doesn't really impinge on the specifics of qualia beyond the size of phenomenal consciousness. But I I would say that that's no small thing.
Yes.
It may even be the basic dimension of consciousness is the size of phenomenal experience. But I certainly do not deny that we need other parameters to explain more specific things about consciousness. Maybe specific things about qualia, maybe specific things about being able to hold things in mind. Um, it was once said that the entropic brain model is similar to the integrated information theory of consciousness of Giulio Tononi, but depurated of its integration term. So, in other words, it's the information bit of that model but without the other bit. And that was proposed as a critique, but it's actually I could spin it as a compliment, because the information bit is the bit that we know works. So, like I said, in terms of predicting a state of consciousness, is it low? Is it expanded? Is it deep sleep or NREM or REM sleep, dream sleep? Is it contentless sleep or contentful sleep, dreaming? Entropy will tell you that, and that's the information component of IIT. But IIT just got too complicated unnecessarily, I would say, and hasn't done a great job yet of telling us what it really means by the integrated bit. Like, what is that
Right.
in the brain? We could come up with things. Maybe there's a bit of overlap with another model of consciousness, the global neuronal workspace that brings up high-level networks, frontoparietal communication. There may be a convergence around the integration thing. But the entropic brain, yeah, I know it's there. As in, like, that piece of the puzzle has value and is important. But I've intentionally made my model or presented my model very, very simply. But the intentionally simple and intentionally a component that works.
Right.
So yeah, and I said I'd come back to the taking the model to breaking point. We can do that now because it's kind of relevant.
Please.
I do think there are cases where brain activity can become so entropic that consciousness, broadly defined, is lost, or some aspect of it is lost, and yet some aspect of it remains. And I think, for example, a high dose 5-methoxy DMT experience might be a good case example of that. I suspect that brain activity is being pushed to an extreme of entropy. I suspect that. We've seen signs of that in some recent data. I think there was signs of that in George Blackburn's work out of UCL, EEG work looking at the 5-methoxy DMT. The Everest of psychedelics, the God molecule, the most intense psychedelic experience possible, 5-methoxy DMT. People describe that as like a clear light. It's like the void that is nevertheless pregnant with possibility, infinite possibility. That paradox with a void that is also everything, and I suspect there is an extreme of the entropic brain effect and an extreme expansion of consciousness, yet some critical dimension of it is lost. And to give some credit back to the IIT model in its most basic form, I think there's something saying, integration term, you've broken the integration. There's no integration here. People come out of that experience and can't fully remember it. So there's a kind of amnesia often. They say was it contentless or contentful? So they say that something is lost, the ability to hold onto stuff and make sense of it. All the sense making happens after the fact, presumably as structure and form recoalesces and recovers. But in the extreme state, things aren't held on to. And so, yeah, I would say there, in my jargon, my vocabulary, I'd say you've obliterated ego consciousness. There is no semblance of the structured brain activity necessary to maintain ego consciousness. So there's no ego. It's a full, complete ego vaporization, as I put it, obliteration. Yet phenomenal consciousness persists. There is still something it is like to be on 5-MeO-DMT. You still have phenomenal consciousness. You still have subjective experience. In fact, it continued to get bigger. So that entropic brain principle held up. It kept expanding and expanding it and expanding to a point where
Fascinating.
people after a 5-MeO trip say it was infinity. It was
Yeah.
timeless infinity. So it's as big as, it's endlessly big. So that's the dimension where the model works and where the model breaks in terms of being a model of consciousness that includes another component. I'd call it ego consciousness. It's relevant and related to that integration term in IIT. It's in that extreme entropic state that you'll lose any semblance of order, and you'll lose ego consciousness. So yeah, I don't think you could say that evolutionarily a 5-MeO state is optimal. I don't think a species walking around it couldn't walk for a start, um, would be, would be the fittest, and able to survive and procreate more freely and ably in a 5-MeO state. So evolutionarily, it's not optimal to be in that state, but the state is possible. So that's telling us, phenomenal consciousness pushed to an extreme of its size. While consciousness can be expanded, that expansion isn't necessarily evolutionarily advantageous. You
Interesting.
might
Yeah.
spin it and say, yeah, but when you come down, you bring all that insight, and you can be a more zen human being now that you've experienced something like a death while not actually physically dying and coming back. You can bring all the benefits that people get from like a near-death experience, and be wiser. And I think there's something to that. I do. But we need to be careful when we romanticize, psychedelic states. Is not obvious. That stoned ape hypothesis, popularized by Terence McKenna. Yeah, I've always found that quite problematic. The claim that there's some advantage to be tripping evolutionarily.
Mm.
Um, I could again, the qualification would be, yeah, maybe when you come back, but not necessarily there. It's more. It then becomes quite independent of the drug experience, and more, what do you do with your own, and I'll go there, with your own free will. What do you do with your behavior and your lifestyle? And, do you cultivate a wisdom, or do you forget your lessons and go back to being somewhat blinkered and back into the ego tunnel?
Yeah.
We all come back to our ego shoes. If we didn't, we wouldn't come down. It's just inevitable that we come back to the shoes that are ego consciousness. Naturally, we slide back into those, but it's what we then do once we're back in those shoes, that makes the difference. Yeah.
That's all so interesting. I love all of that. I was lucky enough to speak to David E. Nichols yesterday. Probably the greatest living psychedelic chemist. Who I think you've worked with, right? He supplied some psychedelics for your lab.
He did for Hopkins and some others. But yeah, he's a friend, and yeah, such a legend in the space for sure.
Yeah, he was talking about his 5-MeO DMT experience, which, funny enough, the conversation kind of started similarly in that I asked him, how he got into psychedelics, and he also said, oh, I was young and I tried it, but he had 5-MeO DMT and he experienced this infinite nothingness and was shot into this expansive universe and described seeing like this glowing bulb in the middle of this infinite universe, and he thought that was the womb of life, and
Mm.
such a powerful experience to have. But why is it that people seem to have similar psychedelic trips? Like, why would there be continuity in the hallucinogenic experiences that people have. This is another idea that's always really interested me. Like you said, infinity there. Like, why is it that people seem to get a sense of infinity? Why is it that when people take DMT, they experience mischievous mechanized machine elves? Like what on earth is that about? Like, what if it is purely hallucinatory and it is just purely, delusion? Like, why would there be any continuity in that experience? I presume this is something that you've thought about as well.
Yeah. It's because we share a very deep evolution. Yeah. So we're, human beings with ego consciousness. It's hard to know quite how long we've had that, but some would speculate not that long, like a few thousand years maybe, with this quality of ego consciousness, maybe somewhat dependent on civilization and a bit of a sort of chicken and egg, what came first question there, but something reinforcing about changing our behavior, settling down, farming and that kind of thing. And in concert with that, developing this certain quality of consciousness, ego consciousness. But you're going back now evolutionarily to when was the birth of subjective experience. That's a long old way back. You'd probably track it back close to the origin of life on the planet. And these things being quite close, a basic sentience, a basic subjective experience, arising pretty soon after the emergence of life, the basic initial forms of life. So, okay, that's pretty far out, weird way to answer the question, but the point is that we've all been on the same journey. And so we share what Carl Jung would call a collective unconscious. The unconscious has always been somewhat problematic as a term because it sounds like unconsciousness, and that's misleading because it's not. The unconscious is more like primary consciousness or primitive consciousness. It's the bigger consciousness that sits mostly dormant in us, that pops up into ego consciousness every now and then and can come through under psychedelics as ego consciousness is broken down. And in a sense, we go back to that earlier primary consciousness, sometimes with a little bit of ego consciousness hanging on. But I would say on a high dose of 5-MeO, that goes away too. So you go to the same place because you're going to the same place based on our shared ancestry and the experiences that we've picked up as a species along the way. So, we're a species that's very visual. We're a species that's very social. Many of the visions are of that nature. They might be as beings or entities. And of course, they can be wildly weird. But we're just trying to make sense of that extreme excitation that's happening in these functional modules in our mind and brain. But they gotta come from somewhere, and this is where I might butt heads with, say, an Andrew Gallimore. I would say, look, he would say you literally go to another dimension, and that there's something like paradigm exploding about DMT entity encounters. Like they're actually really real, and we can go to this other dimension. There's some kind of portaling into this other dimension. And for me, as a skeptic, I'd say, yeah, how does that work exactly? Unpack that for me. Like, tell me. Well, I don't know. It just really feels like that happens. Well, I would come in and say, I think there's probably a simpler explanation. And let's begin by agreeing that the experience is wild and compellingly immersive. It really feels like you go to another place. It really feels like you're in the presence of these all-powerful other beings, and maybe have a plan for you, or or wondering why you're there. So there's some mentalizing going on. You're imagining what they're thinking. And it really feels like that. But I think it comes from the mind, and I think it comes from the brain. I don't think that there's a transcendence of naturalism. Yeah, I mean, this is where supernaturalism comes close to a kind of sci-fi, dare I say it, sort of pseudoscience, where it's what do you actually mean? What's let's put some substance, let's put some meat on the bone that you're suggesting here. How does it actually work that you portal to another dimension? Oh, I don't know. You'd say the same thing with any kind of supernaturalism, or when you die, you go to heaven and it's this other place. Okay, so how does that work? There are ghosts that walk around in this world. Okay, but how does that work? And there are just huge gaps in that ontology, you might say. God in the gaps, as some would say. It's kind of empty and requires a huge leap of imagination. I mean, it's very popular and people enjoy it, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of its substantiveness.
Yes.
So to say that actually, I think it's probably because we share an evolution, and there are ways that our minds and brains are primed and designed and develop that lead us towards having these same experiences. Again, in the language of Jungian psychology, they're archetypal. Archetypes can be specific visions, like of a great mother, a caring presence, and then you just think, well, there's many, many versions of that archetype. A nurse, caring. I don't know. Let's go to a grandmother now. That's slightly different, but still caring, maternal. The good mother. We might think of Mother Mary and that, archetype. Or let's switch now. Let's go to malevolence. Let's go to the witch. The evil female archetype, cunning and tricky and wanting ill for an infant or whatever. And so these are images. They're naturally slippery, they're naturally abstract, but they are images that are, imagistic representations, visual or visionary representations of core, I would say, human themes that have mattered through our shared evolution and ancestry, that typically transcends any kind of cultural um, differences. They're quite universal. I think the great mother, the good mother, crosses all culture and races and geographic places on this planet. As does malevolence, we can all associate with a monster, Um, so the culturally, transcendent, and very, very human. And so that's why we go to the same place. It's because we've all been on the same journey, just over countless lifetimes, even in different forms, as we transitioned into being eventually this species that hasn't been around for long.
Right. I'm speaking to Andrew Gallimore in a couple of weeks, so I'm excited to bring up your issues with his idea. Now, I'll find out exactly how the dimension flipping happens, and I'll shoot you an email
Yeah.
once he answers these
What's the
questions.
answer? So how does it work, Andrew? How does it really work? Come on, let's unpack it now. I mean, I love Andrew. He's a great character. He's so articulate and great fun to listen to. Send him my regards. I'd like to think there's no sort of antipathy between us at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, we would have fun sort of batting that one around, I think.
I sort of buy some of your answer. I don't know if it gets me the full way there, because I definitely understand that there are, powerful union archetypes that transcend culture in ways that we don't even possibly understand, and maybe they're really deeply ingrained in our brains because that's how evolution has wired us, and I can accept that. But then you hear about like Lilliputian hallucinations, when people take a very specific type of mushroom and they see these little people run around and they're like rearranging your stuff in your bedroom, and like is that all? Maybe that's the dwarf archetype. Maybe that's again. But then, why would it be a particular psychedelic that triggers that particular hallucination? Is that finding as solid as maybe I've read it? You've heard of this? That there's like a particular type of mushroom that triggers these Lilliputian hallucinations, named after, I think, Gulliver's Travels. I think
Yeah.
is that
Well,
is that is that accurate? Is that solid?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'd like to know if it is. I haven't seen that work published about a specific mushroom with a specific
Okay.
psychoactive ingredient that produces a specific hallucination across people.
Okay.
So I think sounds a bit like hearsay. I don't know the science. I
Totally,
don't know
totally
the
could
evidence.
be. Totally could be. I'm gonna go check that once
Yeah,
once we
let me
finish
know.
this call. There's one other entropy type ignorance that I was hoping you could help me on. So another understanding I have with psychedelics is that it enhances what you would say global connectivity is sort of a phrase that people you would kind of throw around, that it would increase the connectivity between brain regions that don't usually communicate with each other. My understanding of that is that that would also be opposed to increases in entropy. For
Yeah.
neural populations to talk to each other, they have to be in the same frequency like a radio signal. They have to be sort of speaking the same language to some extent, and then they can synchronize their activity and then that allows those brain regions to communicate in quotes and have form larger neural networks that have some sort of effects. Why would that happen if the brain becomes more entropic? Because again, that would mean that those neural populations are more desynchronized. It means that they are less structured, less patterned. Is it the case that some parts of it are more entropic and some parts of it aren't? Because that also seems like a bit of an opposing paradox to me.
Yeah. It is a paradox, and it's one that has confused me as well, to be honest. I think these states of global functional connectivity, they must be sharing some variance in the signal, some aspect of it. So one answer, I think, might be that they're sharing a higher frequency oscillation. So the frequency that was sustaining the let's say default mode network, um, that has lessened, and now you have higher frequency. We can think of it in the temporal domain, things activity oscillating or fluctuating in their activity levels up and down faster, um, and across systems they're showing that. Um, and so, yeah, that would account for um, the loss of the differentiation or segregation between systems. Maybe in normal waking consciousness, these different systems, they'll fluctuate quite slowly in their activity levels, seen through fMRI, fluctuate quite slowly and orthogonally. So their activity, while the DMN is going up and down like this, where its trough is, another network is going up there. And so you might say they're anti-correlated or inversely correlated. And there are some systems like the default mode versus the um, attention system, or the executive control system, or the dorsal attention system, that sometimes show this orthogonality. Well, they certainly show the orthogonality, but they also show this inverse sort of yin yang relationship. One goes up while the other goes down, which sort of makes sense because DMN is more looking inwards, dorsal attention is more focusing outwards. But I think what happens to carry that global connectivity effect, which is remarkably reliable. I'm a co-author on a meta-analysis that's pulled as much of the field's fMRI data that we can get together. So a lot of different teams across the world, different teams, different psychedelics, pull it all together, run some metrics, and the global connectivity increase was the most consistent one. So it's there as a reliable effect. It's just the interpretation is tricky. And I do hear you. It's a bit confusing because you think, well, now that sounds like, could that not be seizure? Global connectivity, everything going up and down in sync, in synchrony, and so low entropy, no consciousness. But it's not that. So that no, it's not that. It's not that profile. So what is it then? And I think it's this. I'd call it faster and finer activity. If we could figure out, what populations are segregated in that mix, that would be very interesting. Like, are there different networks that we're not used to that aren't these coarse grain networks, like the DMN that has a big blob here and a big blob there, a couple of blobs on the side, like half of the brain almost is the DMN. Very coarse grain pattern. Maybe, well, we've got some data to support this under psychedelics. The patterns that you see are much finer grained spatially, like Arabic art or Persian art that you'd see in a mosque with all the fine grain intricacy. At a distance, it might look uniform, but you zoom in and you see all this intricacy. I would say that's the way to think of it. It's not entirely devoid, I think, of structure and organization. It's more that the organization has gone faster and finer. And what that's encoding for specifically, I don't think we yet know, apart from the simple general purpose model of the entropic brain, which is, well, that's more bits of potential information as would be, a way to articulate the entropy phenomenon. It's more bits of potential information, more independent bits of signal, because they're independent because they move up or down in not in synchrony with each other. That's the independence. So quite what they're encoding for specifically, we don't know, other than they're encoding for this feeling of expanded consciousness. And sure, there is a challenge to the model that I'm interested in, that a few of us are interested in. Like, how do you differentiate a 5-MeO experience of infinity from an NN-DMT experience of machine elves who are wondering why you've moved into their dimension? Like, one is richly visual and quite classically psychological in terms of like theory of mind. I'm thinking, what are they thinking? Why are you here? Oh, you've come here again, and all this kind of this quite high level aspects of cognition, whereas 5-MeO is more this immersion in this, void, so to speak. How can both be carried by the entropic brain effect, and what's the difference there? Very, very curious question that I don't have the answer to yet. I suspect with NN-DMT, there is a retaining of some modular function, because you'll need specific module to do specific things, like, what are those entities? And they're wondering why I'm here again. Like, that has to rest on some maintenance of modular function in the brain. And I think 5-MeO must push past that. It's poetic. it's not science. It's more anthropology in a sense, or theology. But in ancient Hinduism, you have the idea of Maya, which is the sort of you might say the veil, the representation of things, the dance of reality, the visions that you might see. Let's say under NNDMT, that's Maya, the play. Also, the play, the show is Leela as well in ancient Hinduism. And then past that is reality as it really is, which is Brahman or everything. And yeah, so I think being still in Maya is like there's still some semblance of the way the mind and the brain work in normal waking consciousness. Is just you've left the anchorage to our sensory epithelia, our eyes, our senses that are anchored to information coming in. Typically on NMDMT, you have your eyes shut, and that mechanics, the mechanisms that will process sensory information are still working, but the propagating signal isn't is being made sense of without that anchorage to the external world. So it's like a dream in that sense. You're making sense of the brain's functioning as if it is experiencing a world. There's like a
Yeah.
hijacking of how the brain ordinarily works when we are truly taking in the external world. And for whatever reason, 5-MeO, I think just, it's such a up anchoring that there's, you push past Maya is the poetry into Brahman. And I think that's the difference. And I have heard it described that with 5-MeO, in the initial phase, there is a visual aspect to it, and like classically visual aspect with say fractals, but it quite quickly pushes into this other space that is beyond that is more just like a white vastness, brilliant white vastness. Yeah.
I love how you bring in these different perspectives. I mean, you highlighted at the start that you like to, jump between the brain chemistry, the neuroscience, and the psychology, but then you also connect in, religious archetypes and all of these big cultural ideas. So I love all of it. So fascinating. I love how you talk about this as well. I really want to. Is the main difference between these psychedelics in the interaction with the serotonin receptor? Like we think about the massive variance that these substances have physiologically, psychologically for so long, difference in time. Is the fundamental difference how they interact with the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, or is there other variables at play? Because it's hard to believe that one of them DMT can last for 15 minutes, whereas LSD can last for 12 hours. Mushrooms, psilocybin is like 4 hours. Is it simply the interaction between the ligand and the receptor? Like, is it that simple?
Well, that's where it starts. People who might strawman cognitive neuroscience might say, but that's horribly reductionistic. How could you experience my communion with God? How could you explain my communion with God under 5-MeO as that compound having more of a serotonin 1A receptor agonist component to its pharmacology? And they're right in a sense. It's like if you want a good mapping for that territory is the experience of communing with God. Mapping is whatever biology I bring to the table, we bring to the table to say this is a map for the territory. A more satisfying map might be at a higher level, looking at the quality of brain dynamics. Maybe a profound, such a profound high entropy state that the brain activity is so disordered that there's very little semblance of order. And yet, maybe when you come back, the brain and mind make sense of that randomness, extreme randomness in a way that, well, that's the way of reality, and we piece that together and create this consensus reality, this Maya, um, and they might say, okay, well, that's a kind of a nicer map, because I can sort of see some bridge points there, some translational bridge points between, say, deconstruction in terms of brain function and deconstruction in terms of my phenomenology, what it felt like. I can see that there's a translation. Where they can get lost and sometimes get a bit annoyed even is like, how can you explain my thing from this serotonin 1A receptor? They might even say, I don't care about that. I care about the fact that I met God. And of course, I would say, well, you're meeting God. You may be seeing it through a cultural frame. But what do you mean? And then they unpack it, and then you might come to something like, oh, actually, there's a universal experience that's transcendent of cultural frames and terms, like a monotheistic God. The ancient Hindus didn't have that. That they would say in the Upanishads, like, oh, this person believes this God, and this person believes that God, this person believes this God, but they're all the same. They're all Brahman, those are just manifestations of the underlying. Anyway, serotonin 1A receptor. Yes, it's true that's the initial lock, in a sense. That's the initial gate. And so it does matter, and it does have a fundamental importance. And if you were to block that gate, you could have never opened the door. So it does have a fundamental importance. It all starts there. It's just to make a mapping between the biology and the phenomenology, you wouldn't necessarily go there. It's too low a level, but it's nevertheless a critical, starting point for the biology, for the process.
Yes.
Serotonin 1A receptors that 5-MeO hit are densely expressed on more primitive structures in the brain than the serotonin 2A receptor that NN-DMT hits and binds to with a high affinity, LSD, psilocybin, those more classic psychedelics. They're much more 2A preferring, but 5-MeO that has that 1A preference, it's binding to receptors in older structures like the midbrain, where I call it the serotonin pump is. Call it the dorsal raphe nuclei. It's where all the cell bodies are for the neurons that spit out serotonin here, there, and everywhere in the forebrain, in the higher brain. That's where the pump is, and it has a clock-like regularity. The raphe, 1 hertz, 1 a second, pumping serotonin out. A lot of 1A receptors on that. I strongly suspect that 5-MeO affects that pump and shuts it off. And I think that might have a synergistic interaction with the more classic entropic effect in the cortex, scrambling things up, jiggling things up. So I think it's a double whammy with 5-MeO, and probably something about its kinetics, where we typically, vape it, or it might be IM. So it gets into the body fast, and it shuts that serotonin pump off fast. And so I think that's part of it. I have heard, and it makes sense to me, that, say, LSD, which also has a high 1A, serotonin 1A receptor affinity, in sufficiently high doses, it can be like 5-MeO. And I suspect that's because the LSD is starting also to saturate the serotonin pump and really shut it off. So again, you're getting that double whammy that you would get with 5-MeO, 1A and 2A, causing a sort of double whammy entropic brain effect. Yeah.
Super interesting. I'm always trying to explain this. People really think that drugs have like linear effects. So like if I take twice the amount of acid, I'll just have twice the amount of experience. And I'm always trying to explain that at different doses, you can have different receptor combinations because a particular type of receptor becomes saturated and then they start binding to other receptors, and that can just have a completely different effect. So, like, I think the general population, it's why I'm so passionate about drug education in general. I think the general population have such a terrible idea about how drugs actually work. They just, and you can argue that none of us have a complete idea. As you say, the drugs bind to the serotonin receptor, and then all of the chemical signaling that happens after that is a little bit of a mystery. But I still feel like there's such a chasm that exists between, the amount of drug taking that exists and will always exist, and then the amount of education and knowledge on these topics. And it's why I love what David Nutt does and all of his organizations and how much educational content he puts out, and why I appreciate that you make a lot of content. I think it's so important. But, like, why do you think there's such an ignorance gap there? Like, again, like, in just people really do not even have even the basic understanding, I think, of a lot of how these substances work.
Yeah, I think it's because drugs are a political matter. You might say consciousness is a political matter. Perhaps David appreciates this more than anyone. Alcohol has a cultural history, and the general cultural bias in the West, because it's not everywhere, is that that's okay, that's fun. It's St. Patrick's Day. We have a drink. That's fun, and um, so I get all that. But then other cultures think, alcohol is bad, and you'll do bad behaviors, and they're right, and a lot of social ills are associated with it. Yeah, so it depends on our enculturation. And what's happened with psychedelics is that into the mid to late 60s and 70s, with the war on drugs through Richard Nixon, psychedelics got lumped in with narcotics and bad drugs. And then there was also a fear mongering related to how weird the subjective effects are with psychedelics. So into that unknown mystery for, the man in the street who doesn't really know what it's like to be on a psychedelic, we project. And we project that it's devilish, it's evil, and it sends you crazy, and you'll do murderous things, suicidal things. And so we project all this darkness into that psychical space, which in truth is some darkness. It's the shadow of the human psyche. But the projection is all there. It's all shadow and no light. And then the romantics come along, the pro-psychedelic enthusiasts, and they project only light, and they hype all of that. And you have this ridiculous polarity here.
Yes.
With one side projecting all shadow and one side projecting all light. And I'd want to come along and say it's both, It's light and dark. And one of the valuable things about the psychedelic experience is that you can get to shine a light on shadow, actually, and get to know that aspect of the human psyche, ideally so that we're less under its pull and, unconsciously under its pull. And a little bit more aware and conscious in that, way of thinking of consciousness in terms of reflective awareness, quite close to ego consciousness. So again, ego consciousness is not all bad. It's close with reflective awareness. And we can slow down, and in our ego shoes, we can be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's shadow. And be a bit more empowered and have a bit more agency and be a bit more watchful of it. Yeah, that's the narrative I'd love to bring into the psychedelic space. It is
Yes.
just to keep banging on that message that they're not all good and they're not all bad. Depends how you use them. And if there is the greatest value would be one of self-understanding. It would be of education about the human psyche. And if we don't do that well, then we can slip up in many different ways. We could do the projection that the drugs war, ignorant people do, projecting all shadow drugs are bad, psychedelics are all bad, they should all be banned, and people should be punished for ever even thinking about them. They can never cure any kind of mental illness. That's all nonsense. That's a position of incredible ignorance, misunderstanding of the topic. To another extreme where we romanticize, or we start to get kind of loose and think of pseudoscientific things, whether it's transitioning to other dimensions or some kind of like, head in the clouds idealism about psychedelics turning people on to become, better people and just naturally take psychedelics, turn on, tune in, drop out, and the world will be a better place. That's not right either. But some middle ground, which is tools to better understand ourselves, to gain more agency and self-understanding, to be better, citizens in the world. That's the key. That's the key. So you end up realizing that it's a step on from the psychedelics. One doesn't want to be absolutist, but it's a little bit Alan Watts of like getting the message and hanging up the phone, but not entirely. It's good to know that they're there.
Yes.
They're there, but don't be over reliant on them. But know that they're there is incredibly powerful teaching tools. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. No, really well said. Really well said. I really want to touch on one other area. I mean, there's so many areas that I would go with you. I think you're an amazing communicator and just so fun to talk to. I've spoken to Carl Friston, and the free energy principle and predictive brain ideas are just so fascinating to me at the moment. Talk to me about your collaboration with him and how you took empirical psychedelic data and sort of integrate it into his free energy principle model. How did you collaborate? How did you combine your work together?
Yeah, I was a fan of Carl's. I read a couple of his theoretical papers, one on a theory of cortical function, I think it was, or cortical states. And so early work that came before the free energy principle, but tapping into predictive coding as a model, an approach to understanding how the brain works. And so, I was kind of watching what he was putting out, and I saw him move into the free energy principle, and was, in the room for some of the early lectures he was giving at UCL, where he's based, explaining this principle. And
Nice, that's a privilege.
it was
That's
amazing.
so cool.
Yeah, it was kind of historical.
Yeah.
Very lucky to be there, and he was kind enough to let me sit in on his seminars. So I got to know him pretty well, and very much felt that he had something important. And what I was trying to work out was how psychedelics and the psychedelic experience fitted in. And he probably gave me the answer, and I wasn't ready to hear it. But sometimes you need to hear it from a few different angles. One thing that happened was that, I spoke to Michael Pollan when he was writing How to Change Your Mind. And Michael is a great synthesizer. That's what he does so well. And he was synthesizing different bits and basically made some comments about predictive processing in psychedelics. He was talking about this hollow mask illusion, a optical illusion that doesn't work so well under psychedelics. And the penny dropped for me. Maybe it was the way he writes so lucidly. And I was like, yeah, that's it. And, thankfully through my reading of predictive coding, I kind of knew the jargon to make sense of what it was when I thought, well, that's it. And it was that psychedelics are dialing down the precision weighting on the priors. But that sounds very jargon heavy and inaccessible. So what's a nicer way to put it was psychedelics are relaxing our beliefs. They're relaxing our assumptions. Predictive coding says we experience the world, generally said. So ourselves, the world, everything. We experience everything through internal predictive models. And they work to data compress, to downsample, to catch the gist of things. And that's how the mind and brain work ordinarily. What psychedelics do is to really sort of unzip that process. And so we're not so easily catching the gist of things. All that gist perception, that catching the gist is affected, is decreased, is impacted, is dysregulated, and as that goes away or goes down, what comes up is this sense of, I guess, wonder and awe about all of the stuff that's coming up, whether it's visions, feelings, memories, maybe even insights. On that level of insight, it's like you're finding pieces of the jigsaw that previously were under the sofa or whatever. And now you're like, okay, you start to piece it together and you start to see these gestalts that previously you couldn't. And that's probably the dance of the entropic brain effect, and then a little pushback on it, as you regain structure and you make sense. And most of that is probably on the come down as you're coming back down from the entropic brain effect and piecing things together, but bringing all these extra jigsaw puzzle pieces that you found, under the sofa, so to speak. And so that was it. It was like, oh, yeah. And I called it Rebus for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. Maybe one way to think of it is, okay, if you think of ego dissolution or ego disintegration as a quintessential aspect of a high dose psychedelic experience, then that is what I mean. Ego is an assumption. It's a belief. It's the constellation of beliefs about who we are. And that breaks down, and we call that ego dissolution, and that is the relaxing of that particular belief structure at the center of our waking consciousness, the essence of ego consciousness, and that's very aligned with the model is ego dissolution, but there's so much that you can align with it. So yeah, that was the penny drop for me. And then, I think I put that out in 2018, maybe, the Rebus model. And it still feels good as a model, and it helps make sense of how psychedelic therapy can work as well. So not just the phenomenology of a trip, but the experience and mechanics of treating mental illness and remediating the problems that were underwriting the mental illness. Yeah.
Really well said again. Something that Carl and I spoke about, which I find so interesting, is how some priors seem to be strengthened in a way, and then some priors just get absolutely eviscerated by a jackhammer. And one consistent experience I've had when I'm on LSD or something similar is that the types of priors that dissolve are very much societally based. So very, very high level priors about like what society expects from me, like how much money I should be making, making hierarchical comparisons with my friends, or, they're getting promotions, they're making more money. Like, oh, maybe I should be on this path. Why am I not on a more traditional path? Those are the kinds of priors that just get eviscerated and just get destroyed. The types of priors that are strengthened and seem really strong are, God, isn't it just amazing how grateful I am to be healthy and that I have my body and that I love my friends and I love my family. And why do I want to hug that tree? And God, nature is so nice and animals are just the best. And then I'll watch Animal Planet for like 6 hours and donate €200 to, save the to save the red pandas. I mean, this has happened literally multiple times. This exact thing has happened. And it's very consistent for me that it's like, it's all of the societal bullshit that just gets jackhammered away. Like, those are the priors where I'm like, why do I even care? Like, why do I care what other people think? Why do I care that my friend just got promoted? I should be happy for him. Like, that's not a good thing that I'm making those social comparisons. I'm curious, is that a consistent finding? Are those the kinds of high level priors that in general people seem to be like, well, none of this matters. That's all bullshit. And if there is consistency in that, why is that the case? Why are those the priors that are loosened, and why are the lower level priors like, me, my friends, my family, nature, why are those the priors that seem to get strengthened and consolidated?
Great question. I would slightly maybe reframe how you describe the different priors, and not meaning to be offensive at all. It's just that this is how it is for me and how it is for everyone, I think.
Nice.
The first set of priors are ego priors, I would say. They're relational. You said they're societal, but there was a common denominator really, which was a lot of uses of the word I. There was self-referential talk, sure, put to society, but always relational, with the self being an anchor. And you're right, it's those priors that go, um, and ones that don't go, that you might say get a bit of a massage, are ones that are self-transcendent. You might say that it's somewhat selfless. Like, why do I eat other mammals? That doesn't feel right now. Why am I so blind to the beauty of the world out there, nature? And I don't give it enough care, and we're so lucky to have it. I'm so lucky to have my loved ones. Why was I getting so caught up in my own bullshit, not to realize that, my son's struggling at school, or this or that? And so there's a beautiful selflessness to the stuff that comes through, that we then can reflect on. So I do think that would be the way I'd frame the difference between the type of priors, if you want. I think the selfless priors are they clearer perceptions? Are they, when is something a prior, and not a almost a beliefless perception? It's a hard one to answer that. And if we always experience the world through our internal models, we're never really free of that cave, or that sort of windshield that's in the way of the world out there. That's just the way it is. We have to experience it that way. But there is something that is somehow clearer, more lucid, I think, about the selfless realizations. I think when they can become priors and become problematic is if we then over-identify, probably if we self-identify or ego-identify with that initial realization. So it starts off, why aren't we more grateful and appreciative of this beautiful world that we live in? We're so lucky. To Donald Trump is a scumbag, and I'm gonna become a activist warrior, a social justice warrior, and over there are all the scumbags, and me and my clan, we're the good guys. And so there's a self identification, and then and it goes awry, and it becomes overly reinforced, overly strong, and actually the irony of it is it becomes an ego prior rather than that. You've lost that initial selfless, clear vision, and that does happen. That does happen, and we just have to. Again, it's a bit like the drugs will give you a lesson. They'll show you the way, but you don't necessarily walk the way. Um, uh, yeah, and the walking of the way, it turns out, I think, in my mind, is actually quite an independent thing from
Mm.
psychedelic. Is a choice that we have to make, and it's unreliable. Like you can't easily make the choice and stick to it. Like it's going to require some practice and commitment, and so it becomes another thing. And I think those who turn on to the insight that psychedelics can give you, and then at some point move away from psychedelics and take up, say, spiritual practice, contemplative practice. I have a lot of respect for those people, and I think they have found a good path. Um, and I think there's a lesson there for how we approach psychedelics, is to maybe look at those wise souls that to some extent have let go of psychedelics, not necessarily in a way where they would be speak about them in a negative way, but they're a bit more take it or leave it. um yeah there's people like Jack Cornfield, for example, who is clear to me that I think he wouldn't have gone down the path he went down, which is to become this incredible Buddhist teacher, meditation teacher, had he not have experienced the psychedelic experience. But where he is today seems to me quite far removed, really, from psychedelic drugs. He might bring them up, but he'll bring them up in quite a wise and balanced way, an equanimous way, where you're not hearing him view them as all good or all bad. Oh yeah, those are useful tools and they help me along my way. But I wouldn't get too wedded to those. And wise meditation people might also say, don't get too wedded to the immersive meditative states, because you can develop an over attachment there. There's a beautiful wisdom to the sort of light touch principle, that you'll hear in Buddhism, and the middle way principle that you'll also hear in Taoism, of like holding things lightly. I read a book once called Buddhism Before the Buddha, something like that. It's like the original Buddha's teachings, that we can guess that probably came from this guy. And the gist of it is like, beware of beliefs. It's very rebus, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
Irony to what I just said there,
exactly.
attached to one's own models. But yeah, it's like, beware of beliefs, hold everything lightly. Yeah.
Super interesting. You said that you made a comment earlier that there was some cultural consistency in experiences. I mean, what I got from what you relayed there is that it's so deeply personal, obviously, the experience you have and the types of belief changes and realizations that you can have are so deeply personal to you. I'm curious, has there been many really solid cross-cultural studies done where they, do the exact same study with the exact same or roughly the same amount of participants, same dosage regimen, all of this, but they're in, Bangkok or Delhi? And I'd be so curious on comparing the psychedelic experiences, comparing the types of priors that are relieved. Because again, they just, obviously the human beings have a lot in common, but we also vary a phenomenal amount, which is incredible. I think it's one of the most beautiful aspects of humanity that we vary so much. And I'd just be so curious to really dive into, what are these substances doing in the brains of people that believe in completely different religious structures or have a completely different view around family, or a completely different relationship with, themselves and their ancestors. There are a lot of religions and cultures that have a very strong relationship with your deceased ancestors and things like this, and those can be psychedelic or spiritual experiences for them. Do you know, has this work been done? Because I think too much of science is just, the West, Harvard, 30 white people in Harvard or whatever. And it's just like, I'd be so curious to see how it varies when you put
Mm.
people into radically different cultures.
It's a great question. The quick answer would be no one's really done that systematically. You could find it in some of the rich phenomenology. You could find allusions to that in, say, some of Stan Groff's reports, but nothing systematic. Grant Jones at Harvard did something looking at the differential experiences across racial groups, and found some similarities and some differences. Um, uh, yeah, I think on the deepest level, there's more similarity, but on a somewhat less deep level, you'll see more culturally specific flavorings. Um, but people will debate this for eternity without a clear agreement and consensus. I'll put my cards on the table that I am warm to this so-called perennial philosophy, um, popularized by the likes of Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, William James to some extent, that there is a core experience that transcends culture. Um, but I tried not to become absolutist on things, so I could also appreciate how cultural differences can certainly influence the framing and the vocabulary. I thought it was quite telling that Sam Harris, very well-known atheist and very vocal about that, when he described his high dose, something like 4 or 5 grams of magic mushrooms, psilocybin experience, he said he can completely accept that to someone from a Christian uh, leaning would say, I experienced a communion with the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And I was like, it just very much resonated. And so there, and yet he hasn't converted to Christianity. And I don't think he needs to, but he could appreciate perhaps some of the, beautiful symbolism that you can find in that, cosmology, if you want, that religion. And I think that's it. You can find allusions to something common that can, I think, still transcend cultural frames. I guess a Christian would jump on that and raise a big like victory flag. Oh, look, there's evidence. There's evidence for the Holy Spirit. But I think you could say, yes, okay, yeah, that's a part of the human experience to have that experience, and it's real, and it transcends cultures, and but you don't necessarily have to put a big, this is Christianity and Christianity is the only truth, the way, the truth, and the light, or whatever. um, uh, um, yeah, that's too exclusive, I think, whereas the perennial approach is more pluralistic. It's would let everyone sit at the table, and arguably, more consistent with Jesus's original insight and offering, uh, would be that. But maybe I'm wrong on that and projecting. Yeah, I think there's something very powerful. I'll stick my neck out and say it's inevitable that that's where humanity will go if we survive. We will converge on something like the perennial philosophy, which is like, oh yeah, you're right. Oh no, you guys are right too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you got something too. Oh, I like that. I have
If we
different.
survive being the poignant part at the moment and the huge, gigantic asterisks over everything that's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
Where, just to finish, because this has been so much fun. I think you're just an awesome communicator, an incredible researcher. You have a book. You're writing a book at the moment, right? What's the progress of that? And do you know when it's going to be released?
Um, uh, Something like January, February 2027. It's written. It's just the final touches. The final draft is going back to my editor. He'll check it over, check it back with me, um, to send then on to the copy editor. So it's like very last little jobs that I'm doing. Yeah, feeling good about it. How psychedelics work. That's the
That's
main
that's the title.
message. Yeah, yeah, and then it seems to me to naturally split into two parts. Part one is, you might say, consciousness science. How does a trip work? What happens in the brain to cause a trip? Um, and does tripping teach us about the mind and psychology? And then part two is mental health, and how can we, leverage this and apply it to treat mental illness and better human wellness, mental wellness. Um, yeah, so it covers a lot, a heck of a lot. I think it'd be informative for people about consciousness science, brain function, how the brain works, mental health, what's its nature, how can you most effectively treat it, how does psychedelic therapy compare to current conventional treatments, what's happening now, in terms of the future, the present and the future, what can we expect, what are the pitfalls. Um, so it covers a lot, but at the core of it is an effort to answer how psychedelics work. So for me, there was a somewhat sobering and humbling moment where it's like, yeah, leave the poetry to one side, just say what it is. It's that. People will
I
be
cannot
glad.
wait to read it. I
Uh,
really cannot wait to read it. I've been following all the updates on X, and you are a maniacal research paper, note taker. You'll take your photos of your paper, and it looks like you're absolutely 7 different highlighted colors, scribbles everywhere, arrows gone up here, and I'm just like, the book's going to be amazing. I'm 100% confident. I'm so excited to read it. The mental
Thanks.
health part is just another 3 hour conversation that I would love to have with you that we didn't have time for, because I think that's obviously one of the major practical applications of everything we were talking about. We got quite theoretical, which I loved. You cleared up a lot of, ignorances that I had, and hopefully, surely a lot of the listeners had as well. But I'd love to have you back to dive into that mental health application, because that's just so fascinating, and really where the impact is going to be, right? I mean, in those depression trials and the PTSD, like all of these things, that's really where, 10 years down the line, best case scenario is, psychedelics are being applied in those industries, right? And making very big differences to people's mental health. Is that sort of the overall, the biggest vision you have for where psychedelics could go, is really well integrated into the mental health system, good education?
I hope so, with an emphasis on good education, because we could get it wrong.
Yes.
And I am concerned about that. The forces that are coming in um, aren't coming in really, in my view, with a psychological sophistication that can hold this tool and this territory. I worry that they're trying to engineer out the trip and create what you might call Me Too antidepressants that you take every day, um, for many years potentially, like the SSRIs. Um, I worry about cumulative side effects and issues with being drugged chronically. It's not what psychedelic therapy is about, in my view. It's sort of moving away from drugs and towards a lifestyle change. Um, so I think there are major errors that sadly it looks. I think it's a real possibility that we might make those mistakes. Another one is just just the sheer romanticism towards psychedelics, positive projection. and then people getting into trouble through seeking them out without sufficient education and safeguards in place. Any kind of sort of emphasizing the role of psychological support and engagement on the part of the patient to do the work and process things. I worry about things going awry there, worry about the wrong type of people getting into treatments that have too much psychological volatility to be sufficiently well treated, sufficiently safely treated with this, without enough psychological support, and things going awry because of that. Black swan like events happening because of that, and then them getting a lot of attention. It would be a repeat of the 60s if it went that way. There was some basis to the scare stories that were popularized in the 60s by certain media, alarmist media. There was a basis to some of that. It could happen again. So we could make the same old mistakes and new ones. And so it's a shame to put a downer on things, but it's just a healthy reality check that we could really get this wrong still. And
Yes.
that's another motivation for the book, is to say that very clearly. I would say with quite a pure agenda, I think. It's not to bias anything in particular apart from safeguarding people and understanding what we have here. So I dedicate a whole chapter to risks and pitfalls, and it's the longest chapter. It's the penultimate one, and that felt appropriate to do.
Robin, you're amazing. I can't wait to read the book. I'm so excited for whenever we do our round 2 conversation. This was so much fun. Thank you so much for your time. It really was.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you, Evan. Thanks for having me.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free